It was 3 o'clock in the morning. The city slept. The streets were empty, the sky heavy with silence. But in a single dimly lit studio, Michael Jackson's voice was rising from the shadows. Not the polished voice that sold out stadiums. Not the flawless takes that dominated charts. This was something raw, trembling, unlike anything his producers had ever heard before. They would later say that they still felt haunted by it. Not because the song was bad, no, far from it. It was unforgettable precisely because it was too real, too close, too naked. It was as if, for 1 hour, Michael had torn down the walls between his genius and his vulnerability, and let them hear the man behind the myth, and what they heard that night would stay burned into their memory forever. The truth is, Michael had always been a creature of the night. He was known to slip into studios long after everyone else had gone home, recording in hours when the rest of the world was fast asleep. He said that darkness made him feel freer, more alive, unbound by the weight of daylight expectations. But even those who had worked with him for years agreed this session was different. One producer described it as standing in a cathedral where God might speak, but instead it was Michael whispering to himself, pouring something into the microphone that we were never meant to hear. And here's the mystery. Nobody can fully explain where that song came from. Some swore it wasn't written down, that he improvised every line. Others believed it was something he had carried for years, a song too personal to share with the public. But what unsettled everyone in that room wasn't just the song itself, it was the way Michael delivered it. His voice cracked in places it had never cracked before. His body shook in ways they had never seen. And when the final note died, the producers sat frozen, unable to speak, unable to decide if they had just witnessed a moment of genius or a confession they were never meant to hear. What did Michael record that night? What lines made seasoned producers lower their heads in silence? And why, decades later, do fragments of that recording still feel like prophecy? Tonight, we open the door to that studio. Tonight, you'll hear the story of the song Michael Jackson recorded at 3 a.m., the song no producer could ever forget. But before we step fully into that night, you have to understand one thing. Michael's relationship with the night wasn't casual. It was obsession. It was ritual. And it's there, in his midnight habits, that the mystery truly begins. Michael Jackson lived in a world of sound, and for him, silence was never just silence. It was a canvas. While others found rest in the stillness of midnight, Michael found ignition. He believed that after dark, the world was stripped of noise, distractions, and expectation. In those hours, he could create freely, unjudged, unseen. Producers used to joke that working with him meant forgetting the sunrise even existed. He would call them at midnight asking if they were awake. And if they weren't, he'd wait, patiently, until they dragged themselves from their beds to join him. The night, Michael once said, has secrets that the day tries to hide. If you listen closely, you can hear them. And so they would gather, sleep-deprived, coffee in hand, entering the studio while the world outside lay in darkness. Some hated it. Others found it thrilling. But none of them could deny that something in him seemed sharper, more electric, when the clock had long passed midnight. On that particular night, the night of the song, the atmosphere was already strange. Michael wasn't pacing, wasn't smiling, wasn't bouncing with his usual restless energy. He was quiet. Almost too quiet. He sat in the corner of the studio with his eyes closed, as if listening to something only he could hear. The producers tried to lighten the mood. One asked if he wanted to warm up. Michael only shook his head. Another asked if he had lyrics ready. Again, no answer, just a faint, faraway hum under his breath. Minutes passed. The room grew heavy, like the air itself was waiting. And then finally Michael stood. He walked toward the microphone without a word, adjusted it with trembling hands, and whispered, "Don't move." The engineers froze. The producers exchanged glances. Something was about to happen, something they weren't prepared for. And with the faint glow of the studio lights painting shadows across his face, Michael inhaled sharply. What came out next would silence every person in the room. To describe that studio on that night is to describe something between a cathedral and a tomb. The lights were dimmed, just enough to see the faint outlines of equipment gleaming in the dark. The walls, lined with soundproofing foam, seemed to swallow every unnecessary noise, leaving only the shallow breaths of those inside. Normally, the studio was a place of energy, laughter, experimentation, playful arguments about beats and melodies. But that night it was different. That night it felt sacred. Even the air conditioning seemed to hush itself. Michael's presence was part of it. He carried himself differently. Gone was the performer with quick steps and sharp commands. Instead, he moved slowly, deliberately, as though burdened by an invisible weight. His eyes, usually alive with sparks of mischief, were distant, shadowed, unreadable. The producers whispered among themselves when he wasn't looking. One said the room felt cursed. Another muttered it felt holy. None of them could put words to the sensation that gripped them. But all agreed. The atmosphere was charged, electric, as if the walls themselves expected revelation. When Michael finally opened his mouth, the first sounds weren't lyrics. They weren't even proper notes. They were soft, broken syllables, almost like a prayer muttered in the wrong language. Some compared it to a man speaking in tongues, reaching for something beyond human comprehension. The room leaned in closer, not daring to breathe too loudly. Every flicker of sound that left his lips seemed to carve deeper into the silence, building anticipation, building dread. And then, just as one engineer considered asking if Michael was okay, it happened. His voice cracked, fragile, almost breaking. A sound no one had ever associated with him. For a moment, they weren't hearing the king of pop. They were hearing Michael, the man. The room shifted. The atmosphere thickened. One producer later confessed that in that instant, he wanted to stop the recording. Not because it was wrong, but because it felt too right, too raw, too invasive, like spying on someone's deepest confession. But none of them moved. None of them could. Michael lifted his head, closed his eyes, and with a trembling breath, he began to sing the first true line of the song. And it was then, in that dimly lit studio at 3 a.m., that the producers realized they were witnessing something they might never fully understand. What those words were, what that melody carried, they could not yet explain. But they knew instantly that nothing in the studio would ever feel the same again. The first real line slipped from Michael's lips like a secret. It wasn't the sharp, perfect projection the world knew him for. It was fragile, trembling, almost reluctant, like a man trying to speak aloud words he had never dared to admit to himself. The producers exchanged glances, uneasy. This wasn't a rehearsal. This wasn't Michael trying to find the right key. This was something else entirely. It sounded more like confession than performance. One engineer later said, "It was like we were eavesdropping on his soul." The lyrics weren't clear at first. They came in fragments, stitched together between breaths, faltering, then rising, like waves crashing against each other in the dark. Some lines were barely audible, whispers carried on the edge of melody. Others burst forth with sudden intensity, piercing the silence like shards of glass. What struck them most wasn't the clarity of the words, but the weight behind them. Michael sounded exhausted, not physically but emotionally, as though each phrase was being pulled from the deepest part of him. His voice cracked, trembled, broke entirely in places, only to surge again with an almost unbearable force. They had seen him sing 1,000 times before. They had seen him chase perfection, demanding take after take until every note landed precisely where it belonged. But here he seemed to care nothing for perfection. He cared only for honesty. One producer, his hands trembling, leaned toward another and whispered, "We shouldn't even be here. This isn't for us." But none of them could move. None of them could look away. The chorus, or what sounded like one, rose suddenly, swelling with such intensity that the air in the room felt charged, vibrating. Michael's body trembled, his fingers curled tightly around the microphone stand. His eyes remained closed, as if he couldn't bear to see anyone watching, and then came a moment that no one in that room would ever forget. His voice cracked, not in weakness, but in something beyond it. It was the kind of break that tore straight through the room, leaving everyone stunned. Some said it sounded like grief. Others swore it sounded like release, like a man finally setting down a burden he had carried for far too long. The producers felt their chests tighten. They didn't know what the lyrics meant, not fully, but they didn't need to. The emotion was undeniable, rawer than anything they had ever recorded. When he paused, just briefly, the silence was unbearable. No one spoke. No one dared. It was as if the room itself had stopped breathing. And then he sang again, softer now, almost pleading. His words, though muffled, carried weight that seemed to sink into the walls. A line hung in the air, incomplete, unfinished, and the producers leaned forward, straining to catch the rest. But Michael didn't finish it. He let it dangle, unresolved, leaving a question hanging like a ghost. That was when one of the engineers reached for the recording console, his finger hovering over the stop button. Not because it wasn't good, not because it wasn't usable, but because it felt wrong to capture something so private, so unguarded. But he didn't press it. Something in him said this moment was too important, too monumental to silence. And so the tape kept rolling, capturing every breath, every crack, every whispered fragment. What Michael was singing didn't sound like a song anymore. It sounded like confession. And yet the question remained. Confession of what? That question would linger long after the night ended, long after the studio emptied. For in that instant they all knew. They weren't just recording music. They were recording a secret, and the strangest part, none of them could fully remember the lyrics afterward. The words blurred together, like fragments of a dream slipping away the moment you open your eyes. But they all agreed on one thing. The melody, the delivery, the rawness of that moment, it would haunt them forever. And just when they thought the weight of that confession could not grow heavier, Michael did something none of them expected. He began to sing a song they didn't recognize. At first, they thought he was still improvising, just letting emotions flow freely into sound. Michael had always been capable of turning stray thoughts into melody, of pulling magic from thin air. But as the moments stretched on, they realized this wasn't improvisation. This was something else. The structure was too deliberate. The shifts between verse and chorus too precise. The melody too haunting to be accidental. And yet, no one in that studio had ever heard it before. Not the producers, not the engineers, not even the assistants who had cataloged every lyric, every demo, every discarded line of his vast archives. It wasn't on any album. It wasn't in any notebook. It wasn't on any list of projects. This was a song that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Michael didn't announce it. He didn't explain. He simply sang as though it had always existed, as though he was recalling something he had carried silently for years. The lyrics, as much as they could catch them, were deeply personal. Fragmented images, loneliness, shadows, voices calling in the dark. They spoke of being trapped, of yearning for release, of a burden too heavy to carry alone. It was the kind of lyric no superstar was supposed to admit aloud. Too vulnerable, too human. One producer later admitted he felt tears rise as Michael reached the refrain. It wasn't just a song, he said, it was like a message. Not to us, not to the world, to himself. The engineers scrambled to keep the tape rolling, their hands shaking. They couldn't risk missing a second. Every line felt like it might vanish if they didn't capture it. And yet, even as they recorded it, something strange happened. The words seemed slippery. They couldn't quite hold them in memory. They'd hear a line, swear they understood it, and then, moments later, it would fade, leaving only the feeling behind. One of the producers described it as trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. The strangeness only deepened when Michael began weaving in lines that sounded prophetic. He sang of endings, of silence, of lights that would go dark too soon. The producers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They didn't know what he meant, and maybe he didn't either. But the words felt heavy, too heavy to ignore. It was then one of them whispered, "This song, it's not meant for us." But the tape kept rolling. Michael sang with his eyes still closed, his body swaying slightly, as though he were channeling something beyond himself. He wasn't performing for the room. He wasn't performing for history. He was performing for the silence, for the shadows, for the ghosts that only he seemed to hear. And when he reached the final refrain, his voice soared higher than it had all night, raw, powerful, broken, and beautiful all at once. The note lingered, hung in the air like a cry that could never be answered. Then, suddenly, he stopped. No fade-out, no gentle hum, just silence. The abruptness stunned the room. The producers stared at one another, wide-eyed, unsure whether to applaud, to question, or to leave in silence. Michael didn't explain. He didn't even look at them. He simply stepped back from the microphone, his chest heaving, and whispered, "Don't play that for anyone." The room froze. Don't play that for anyone. And yet, they had recorded it. The tape was rolling. The song existed. The producers nodded, but inside, each of them knew the truth. Once you heard something like that, you could never unhear it, and so the question lingered heavier than ever. What was this song? Where had it come from? And why, out of all his creations, did Michael not want anyone else to hear it? The answers, if they existed, would only make the night stranger. Because what happened after Michael stepped away from that microphone would change everything. When Michael stepped back from the microphone, the silence in the studio was heavier than anything they had ever felt before. No one clapped. No one smiled. Not even the usual murmurs of, "That was good. Let's try another take." Instead, they sat frozen, as if the air itself forbade them from breaking the moment. And then the questions began to creep in. Should they have even recorded it? One engineer kept staring at the red light glowing above the console, the light that meant the tape had captured every second, every whisper, every crack in Michael's voice. His hand hovered nervously above the stop button, as if erasing it might free them from the weight pressing against their chests. But he couldn't. None of them could. Because deep down, they all knew this was more than just another track. This was history. Strange, unsettling history, but history nonetheless. To erase it would feel like burning a sacred text. To keep it felt like holding on to something forbidden. The tension in the control room was unbearable. One of the producers leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "We shouldn't play this back," he whispered. The others nodded, but their eyes betrayed them. They wanted to hear it again. Needed to confirm what they had just witnessed wasn't some collective hallucination. Another producer muttered, "If the world ever heard this, they wouldn't understand." That was the dilemma. What if it was too raw, too vulnerable? Michael had always been fiercely protective of what he shared with the public. Every note, every word was carefully chosen. This song, this session, it wasn't chosen. It was spilled, torn out of him like a wound reopening. One engineer broke the silence. "We're not supposed to have this," he said, voice low, almost trembling. "This wasn't for us. It wasn't for anyone." And still nobody reached for the stop button. Nobody had the courage to destroy it. Minutes passed. Michael remained silent, still standing by the microphone, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion. His eyes were half closed, unfocused, like someone coming back from a place no one else could follow. The tension grew unbearable. The longer the silence stretched, the more oppressive it became. It was as if they had stumbled into a sacred ritual and now were being punished for staying too long. Finally, Michael spoke. His voice was soft, almost childlike. "Don't forget," he said. The producers froze. Don't forget what? The song, the feeling, the night itself? None of them dared to ask. But in that moment, they realized something terrifying. They weren't just witnesses. They were keepers of a secret. A secret recorded on tape, yes, but also etched into their minds, their hearts, their very bones. The control room, normally filled with chatter, became a chamber of whispers. Nobody wanted to be the one to make the next move. Nobody wanted to be the one to decide the fate of what they had just captured. And then, just when the weight of that silence seemed unbearable, Michael turned, gave them a look none of them could fully interpret, and walked out of the room. The door clicked shut behind him, and suddenly, they were alone, with the tape still rolling, the confession still alive, and the question none of them dared answer. What were they supposed to do with it? The engineers stared at each other. One whispered, "We should stop now," but another shook his head. "You don't stop when God is speaking." The others fell silent. The words hung in the air like smoke, and then, without warning, they heard Michael's footsteps returning. When Michael re-entered the studio, everything about him had changed. Gone was the fragile figure who had just poured out his soul in trembling whispers. His movements were sharper now, deliberate, almost violent in their intensity. His shoulders were squared, his eyes blazing with a strange fire. It was as if he had left the room as one man and returned as another. The producers sat up straighter, uncertain. Was this the same session, or had something new begun? Michael didn't speak. He didn't explain. He simply walked back to the microphone, closed his eyes, and let out a sound that shook the walls. It wasn't singing. It wasn't words. It was a raw, guttural cry, a sound so primal that one engineer instinctively pulled off his headphones, his heart racing. It was the sound of something breaking loose inside him, something that could no longer be contained. From there, the session spiraled into something unrecognizable. Michael began to move with his voice, his entire body swaying, bending, trembling, as if the music itself were coursing through his veins. He wasn't just singing anymore. He was convulsing, almost possessed. Every note was matched by a gesture, every crack in his voice by a tremor in his body. One producer whispered, "It's like he's not even here with us anymore." They watched in awe, in fear, as Michael seemed to slip deeper into another state of being. His fists clenched, then opened. His knees buckled, then straightened. At times, it looked like he was fighting something invisible, wrestling with demons no one else could see. And then came the scream. It tore through the studio like thunder, echoing off the walls, rattling the glass in the control room. It was unlike anything they had ever heard from him before. Not a stage scream, not a performance growl. This was raw, blood-curdling, the sound of a man releasing every ounce of pain he had locked inside. The producers froze, stunned. Some felt goosebumps race across their arms. Others felt tears sting their eyes. One later confessed, "It was the kind of sound that doesn't just hit your ears. It goes straight to your soul." Michael collapsed against the microphone stand, gripping it like a lifeline. His body trembled violently, sweat dripping down his face, his chest heaving with the force of what he had unleashed. And still, he wasn't finished. He began to sing again, softer now, almost fragile, but with the same intensity burning beneath the surface. The contrast was unbearable, the switch from primal screams to trembling whispers, from violent movements to fragile stillness. It was as if they were watching a storm collapse into silence, only to rise again in waves. The engineers didn't know what to do. They recorded it all, hands shaking, terrified that one wrong move might shatter the fragile magic unfolding before them. And then, just as suddenly as it began, Michael stopped. He opened his eyes for the first time in what felt like hours. They were red, unfocused, distant. He looked around the room, as if seeing it for the first time. One producer said it was like watching a man return from the dead. Another whispered that Michael seemed to have left part of himself behind in those screams, in those trembling confessions. The silence that followed was suffocating. Michael wiped his face with his sleeve, turned toward the control room and whispered one word. "Enough." Then he walked out again, leaving them reeling, shaken, and forever changed. The tape still spun. The soundboard still glowed. The recording was safe. But the men in that room knew one truth that haunted them long after the night ended. They hadn't just captured a performance. They had captured a transformation, and the question that lingered in every mind was this: what had Michael become in that moment? And what had he left behind in that studio? Because whatever it was, they could feel it still lingering in the air, long after he was gone. After Michael left the studio that second time, a strange unease filled the room. The tape, still spinning slowly, seemed almost alive, carrying every tremor, every crack in his voice, every whisper of confession. But the atmosphere was heavy with doubt. Something about that night, about the song itself, felt dangerous. Producers had always treated Michael's recordings as treasures, carefully cataloging every take, storing each master tape like a sacred artifact. But this session was different. The rawness, the intensity, the intimacy, it wasn't something to be handled lightly. It wasn't just music. It was an imprint of Michael's very soul. And then, the unthinkable happened. When one of the engineers went to make a backup, the reel wouldn't play. Not a single second. The tape itself seemed to have vanished from the machine. They searched the studio, checked every shelf, every drawer. Nothing. It was as if the recording had simply disappeared. The room erupted into whispered panic. Some producers claimed it had been stolen, perhaps by someone who understood its value and feared its truth. Others suggested something even stranger, that the tape had refused to exist, that the energy Michael had poured into it was too intense, too raw, to be bound by physical form. What if it's cursed? One engineer whispered, half joking, half serious. The room fell silent at the word, but fragments of the song remained. Notes, small sections captured in memory or in partial recordings that had somehow survived. Even in fragments, the song had a haunting power. The melody lingered in their heads for days, weeks, months. Some producers admitted that they would hear lines echoing in their sleep, lines they could not write down, could not replicate, could not fully explain. And the strangest part? Michael never mentioned it again. Never spoke about that session, never alluded to the lost tape. It was as if the event had existed in some alternate reality, seen only by those present, imprinted only in their memories. Years later, rumors began to circulate among insiders. Fragments of the recording had surfaced in private sessions, played only for those trusted enough, or foolish enough, to listen. Those who heard it described a sound that defied expectation, haunting, confessional, almost prophetic. One producer said, "I couldn't sleep for days after hearing it. It was as though the tape knew things I wasn't ready to confront." And then the speculation began. Had Michael deliberately erased the tape? Was it an accident? Or had something more mysterious intervened? Something beyond human understanding, beyond logic? The producers didn't know. They couldn't. But one thing was certain. The song, in some form, had survived. And its survival carried with it a weight that no one could ever forget. Even now, decades later, the fragments that remain feel alive. They feel like a secret meant to haunt, a song that refuses to die. And just when it seemed the mystery couldn't deepen any further, a small group of insiders managed to hear a playback. What they heard would change their understanding of Michael forever. Weeks later, a small group gathered in the studio under conditions of absolute secrecy. Only those trusted by Michael or by the memory of that night were present. The tape was ready, or at least what remained of it, the fragments carefully spliced together to form some semblance of continuity. As the first notes played, the room went still. No one spoke. Even breathing seemed intrusive. The sound was unlike any recording they had ever heard. It was fragile, intimate, and yet immense. Impossible to categorize. Some producers described it as feeling too alive. Others said it was like the studio itself was holding its breath. The song seemed to pull them into Michael's consciousness, into his private world. And the voice was unforgettable. It was raw, unguarded, trembling, yet commanding. One engineer, a veteran of decades of music production, admitted later that he had goosebumps the entire time. "It was as if he were singing directly into my soul," he said. The lyrics were fragmented, but the emotion was whole. Themes of loneliness, longing, confession, and revelation emerged from every line. The melody itself seemed to bend, shifting unpredictably, as if Michael had discovered a secret musical language, one that only he could speak and yet somehow everyone could understand. As the playback continued, a line appeared that made everyone stop in shock. It wasn't just haunting, it was prophetic. The lyric spoke of endings, of light fading, of shadows that could not be chased away. The room fell silent. Some producers whispered, "It's like he knew," like he already saw what was coming. The engineers tried to focus on the technical aspects, the pitch, the tone, the harmonies, but it was impossible. The song refused to be reduced to notes and beats. It was confession, revelation, warning. For a moment, some feared they were intruding on something sacred, something never meant to be heard outside the confines of Michael's mind. But it was too late. The sound had already entered their consciousness, leaving impressions that could never be erased. And then the song ended. But the room didn't return to normal. Silence stretched, oppressive and thick, as if the studio itself was mourning the end of the music. Every person present felt a strange residue, a heaviness that clung to their skin. A memory of the performance that refused to fade. One producer later confessed, "It was like a door had been opened and we all saw something we weren't supposed to. You can't unsee it. You can't unhear it. You carry it with you forever." The playback raised more questions than it answered. What had Michael intended with the song? Was it ever meant for the public? Did he hope it would be discovered only after he was gone? Or had it simply been a private act, a confession set to melody, left to echo in the memories of those who had been there? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, why had he chosen to sing it at 3 a.m. when the world was asleep, when only shadows could witness him? The producers never agreed on a single explanation. They only agreed on one fact: the song was unforgettable. And the fragments that remained, the echoes of that night, carried a power that was both beautiful and terrifying. It was the kind of song that could never be fully captured, never fully understood, yet could never be forgotten. And the secret of it, the haunting truth, would linger long after the studio emptied, long after the tape reels had stopped spinning, long after the world thought it had moved on, because some music, some confessions, some moments of genius, they refuse to be contained. They survive. They haunt. And Michael Jackson's 3 a.m. song was one of them. Weeks, months, even years after that secret playback, one line kept returning to the producers' minds. A single lyric, seemingly simple, yet charged with an almost supernatural weight. "When the lights go out, remember the silence will speak." They couldn't stop thinking about it. What did it mean? Was it a metaphor for fame, a warning about the dangers of the world around him? Or was it something far darker, something only Michael himself understood? The lyric was unlike anything he had ever sung before. Michael's words had always carried emotion, yes, but they had been carefully crafted, polished, designed to entertain and move. This line carried urgency, desperation, clarity, and yet it was wrapped in ambiguity, leaving the listener haunted and unsettled. Producers debated its meaning in hushed voices, often in the middle of the night, replaying the fragment in their heads over and over. Some believed it was prophetic, a premonition of struggles yet to come, or perhaps a warning about the fragility of life and fame. Others thought it was simply a reflection of Michael's inner turmoil, a man wrestling with shadows most of the world would never see. And yet, no one could deny the eerie weight the lyric carried. Even decades later, those who heard it still felt the chill of its presence, the haunting sense that Michael had somehow spoken across time. One engineer said, "I've heard hundreds of his songs, but this line, it doesn't leave you. You hear it once and it stays with you, gnawing at your mind like a memory you can't place." It wasn't just a lyric, it was a message, a whisper from the shadows, a confession wrapped in melody. And the more they thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Had Michael known the line would survive him? Had he sung it not for the world, but for those few who could truly hear and understand? No one had the answer. But all of them, producers, engineers, assistants, agreed on one chilling fact. Once you heard that lyric, you could never forget it. And as they replayed it quietly, almost reverently, they felt it again, the question that would never leave them. What did Michael truly mean? By the time the final fragments of the song were pieced together, its impact was undeniable. The melody, once delicate and tentative, had become a force that could not be ignored. Every note carried the weight of confession. Every pause, every crack in his voice, carried the echo of the man behind the legend. The song had evolved into something more than music. It had become a mirror reflecting Michael's deepest fears, his longing, his vulnerabilities, his brilliance. To listen to it was to step inside his mind, to experience the storm he carried alone. Producers who had once felt fear at recording it now felt awe. This wasn't a song to sell. This wasn't a song to play on the radio. This was an artifact of genius, a message from a man who had mastered performance yet remained, above all else, human. And yet, for all its beauty, it was terrifying. Some fragments seemed to whisper warnings. Others felt like prophecies. Lines about endings, darkness, and silence had a weight no one could ignore. Every playback sent shivers down the spine, and some producers admitted they could only listen to small pieces at a time. It was too much, too raw, too intimate. One producer later said, "It wasn't just the lyrics or the melody. It was him. Every ounce of him, every fear, every joy, every fragment of his soul was in that recording. You couldn't escape it if you tried. And the haunting part? The song was unfinished. That imperfection made it feel more real, more human. It wasn't polished, wasn't perfected. It was alive. It breathed. It ached. It cried. The room where the secret playbacks occurred often felt like a sacred space. The engineers treated it with reverence, sometimes stepping outside to regain their composure after a few minutes of listening. They didn't speak of it casually. To speak of it casually was to betray the sanctity of what Michael had given them, and the lyric, the prophetic line, remained the apex of the experience. When the lights go out, remember the silence will speak. Every replay, every attempt to decode it left them unsettled. It was as though Michael had spoken across time, leaving a riddle for anyone who dared to listen. Was it warning, confession, farewell, or something else entirely? For a moment, all the fragments of the night, the trembling voice, the vanishing tape, the transformation in the studio, came together. The producers, shaken and mesmerized, realized they weren't just listening to a song. They were witnessing a legacy, a truth too powerful to be shared fully, yet impossible to forget. And then it ended, leaving only silence. But the silence carried its own weight. It was a continuation of the song, a reminder that some music never dies, some confessions linger. Some genius cannot be contained by tape or time. The story of the 3 a.m. song remains in many ways a legend, a song that was never officially released, a tape that vanished, a melody that haunted its witnesses for decades. Michael Jackson's genius was never just in his music. It was in his ability to lay bare his soul, to transform the private into something eternal, to speak across time in a voice that still resonates. The song, fragmentary and elusive, serves as a reminder that some art cannot be confined. Some confessions cannot be silenced. Michael left pieces of himself in every note, every whisper, every tremor of that recording. And though the world may never hear it in full, those who were there, even briefly, carry it forever in memory. It is a story of vulnerability, brilliance, and haunting beauty, of a man who pushed beyond perfection to reveal truth, of a night when a voice broke open and a secret song was born. And the echo of that song, though silent to the world, still speaks. It speaks in fragments, in memory, in whispers, and in the hearts of those who dared to listen. Some music isn't meant to top charts. Some songs aren't meant for mass consumption. Some are meant to survive in memory alone, haunting, beautiful, eternal. And Michael Jackson's 3 a.m. song was one of them. For those who hear its fragments, the question lingers. What did it mean? What secrets did it hold? And why, even decades later, can it never be forgotten? Perhaps that is the final truth. The greatest songs aren't always heard. Sometimes they are felt, and this was one of those songs.